in the journalism department. And he got his master's of journalism at UC Berkeley, and has spent the last decade or so producing films about different stories around the world. He's even done some films for National Geographic, and spends his time doing photography, journalism, and filmmaking. And so we're really excited to have him come talk to us about specifically science communication and how we can use videography to do that. And with that, I'll let Jason take it away.
Great. All right. Well, thank you so much, Victoria. Thank you for the invitation. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be here. I'm going to go ahead and share this. And today we are going to have a chat about impact SciComm and how that works, and kind of my background in it, and what I'm doing now that I'm kind of out of the private sector and into the academy. So the place to begin with that, and we'll jump right in, and I should caveat this by saying that I cannot see the Zoom room. So somebody is going to have to go ahead and give me a shout if I dip out, basically. So to begin with, I'm going to give you a little bit of background of where I'm coming from, the work that I've done, and the kind of the position I take when it comes to creating impactful media. And to begin with, this I think is my most flattering bio picture. This is underneath a dam outside of Missoula, Montana, with, yes, a scuba tank. I did not have to worry about the bends for this particular day. But this is a kind of I have a lot of experience working in river systems and working in capturing compelling, or trying to capture compelling images of the natural world. So before coming to URI, I was a freelance journalist. I ran a small scale documentary production company, and in that capacity, worked for a number of organizations and a number of news organizations, did a number of films, put a bunch of kind of work together. So just to give you guys a sense of what that actually meant, the types of stories that I would get out and get into trouble producing. I've been able, very kind of fortunately, I've been able to travel to some pretty wild places, really in the hopes of capturing both the process and the results of science. Biologists out in the field, ecologists out in the field, people actually out doing the work with the idea of showing how to do this work, and kind of explaining the awe and the process behind how science actually works to a broad public. So, for example, I was able to get out to the Southeast Farallon Island, out about 30 miles off the coast of San Francisco. I was able to do that with National Geographic and produced a short video out there. This wasn't even a magazine article. It wasn't even a film. This was just an excuse to get out and produce a 3.5-minute piece about these biologists who were studying northern fur seals. So the kind of the adventure of science has always been a theme that I've wanted to explore, and then showcasing both the power of research, but then the power of our kind of interactions with the natural world. So I've been able to do that in places like Southeast Farallon. I've been able to work for a broad spectrum of clients, both in terms of news and conservation organizations. So I worked with Conservation International in Raja Ampat, Indonesia, to go out and study the Bird's Head seascape, to show some of the conservation efforts that CI had undertaken in the Bird's Head, and to be able to document visually in kind of a rapid visual assessment way the kind of the status of one of the most biologically diverse places in the ocean. So I've had, some pretty incredible opportunities to go out, all with the idea of telling powerful stories, gathering, capturing powerful images. And as that kind of process has evolved, as I've kind of thought more about how do you engage people, right? We'll talk more in a bit about audience, but how do you really think about different places where different people are, and how to engage them around these ideas of not only science, but conservation and protection and research. So one of the ways I was able to actually do that was by going to using the traditional media, but going to a place with an unexpected audience. So if you're unfamiliar with Savour, it is a fancy food magazine. It's a magazine that's really aimed at the kind of, it's like, Bon Appetit Plus. It really is about food and food culture. And a couple years ago, I was able to produce a story for Savour about sea urchins on the Mendocino coast in California. And what was interesting about this story was it really was a conservation story. This was about how sea urchin overpopulation was decimating kelp forests. And so a colleague of mine who happens to be a food scientist came up with this kind of Jonathan Swift proposal, right? An indecent proposal, which was this idea that every Californian should eat their weight in purple sea urchins to do our part as predators, which, if you haven't eaten sea urchin, and uni is delicious, happens to be delicious. So the idea was, how do we engage a brand new audience, in this case, the readership of a kind of a fancy food magazine, in a conservation story about what's happening on the California coast? So in addition to, the kind of adventure and the far-flung places and the process behind getting out to these places that I've been able to do, I've also found ways of trying to engage new audiences around the idea, yes, of conservation, and more increasingly the idea and process behind research. So that's a little bit of background about where I'm coming from before I came to URI. And before we can really talk about impact science communication and the collaboration process and designing for creating impactful media, we have to take a quick deep dive into the media ecosystem. Just a little bit of background to understand the nature and the reality of the world that we live in. Even though it seems to be changing minute by minute, it's worth kind of stepping back and understanding how the media ecosystem exists today. So we are going to take a quick second to understand how it used to be and what has changed. So the way I like to think about that is the way that the media used to function very much was represented by this image. Everybody stayed in their lane. Everybody kind of had the direction that they were going. And if you think about this as the different mediums, the different platforms that the media was using, so cable television, public access television, newspapers, magazines, radios, everybody kind of stayed in their lane. There were expected established gatekeepers. There were expected means of delivery. And, you had, to use this visual metaphor, you would have cars that would change lanes from one medium to another, and they would, kind of self-reflect and all this kind of thing. But they really kind of stayed in their lanes for the most part. And that really happened before the internet. And after the internet, we get this kind of this exit off of this system once the internet is developed. And what the world actually looks like today really is represented by this, by M.C. Escher's relativity. There are in seemingly infinite number of ways, on-ramps, exit ramps, points of entry for media and how we access media, how much of it we consume at any given time, what platform, on what device. The world we live in now the media landscape we live in now, rather, is so fractured that it really behooves us, or behooves me as a content producer, which is not a word I would typically assign to myself, but I will in this regard. How do I take my skills as a visual journalist and match them to the media ecosystem as it exists today, which again is really represented quite well by this M.C. Escher drawing. So that's where we're diving into a little bit more to understand the kind of the different characteristics. And again, this will make sense once we start talking about how you actually conceive of impact science communication projects and collaborations and engaging audiences in different places. So if you think about the media, how it used to exist, it used to be expert-centric, top-down, passive, observational, extractive, largely driven by text, and largely driven in a continuous format, right? You would watch 60 Minutes from front to back. You would read an article, straight through. that the internet has disrupted the media ecosystem, and now it is completely changed and is now the opposite in many ways. So some of the characteristics that would really describe how the media ecosystem works now is it's much more user-centric. Think about platforms like YouTube. Certainly all of the social media platforms are much more user-centric. There's a distributed network both of consumers and producers of media. Again, think of YouTube stars in this context. Media is now much more participatory than it ever was before. The notion of a gatekeeper has pretty much been eradicated at this point. These new media forms are both interactive as well as immersive, and so you're able both to actually interact with other users, but with other devices as well. So this allows for much more collaborative opportunities, both for users and for producers to distribute work. The world is much more visual now than it is driven by print, which makes you realize the importance of understanding visual language, especially when designing projects, and understanding visual communication platforms. And then finally, as the MC Escher print, really shows that it's a much more fragmented world than it used to be. So this background kind of leads us to the principal question, certainly that I pose to students in the Harrington School in the journalism program. But I think what really the entire media industry is trying to understand right now is this challenge, right? Where we must find, as journalists, as visual storytellers, as media producers, it's our job now to find the best tool to tell the story within the medium that will engage the audience. So that's an entirely new proposition than it was even a few years ago, because understanding that there are a host of multimedia tools to go out and actually produce as well as consume media means that you actually have to think about what tool does which job well. And it's interesting now because the devices that we all carry with us, in our pockets all of the time, are both incredible tools for consuming media, which is primarily what we use them for. But we have to realize that these are also incredibly powerful tools for the creation of media. And I should note here that there's a real power for the science community and for the research community engaging in training. We're going to touch on that in a little bit. But the real goal I wanted to talk about today was figuring out what the balance is between, being responsible for creating your own media and you as a researcher understanding these tools, and really understanding where collaboration comes into this picture and how these collaborations can be leveraged to kind of raise all ships. Which brings me to this idea of coverage versus collaboration. And coverage, as you can imagine, was the media 1.0 way that stories broke in the world. So a report gets published, a journalist sees it in a journal, and then picks that story up, makes a few phone calls, runs a story to whatever that journalist's audience is, whether it's radio, print, newspapers, television, whatever. They run that story, and then that's kind of that. What I'm proposing here, and what actually the kind of the work that I've been trying to develop over the last 10 years, isn't coverage as much as it is collaboration. And that collaboration happens really with through three kind of primary avenues that, all working together, drive you towards creating impactful science communication. And those three are collaborative ideation, creative project design, and engagement strategies. And bear with me, there's a little bit of, this sounds jargony and buzzwordy, but I swear this is just plain English here. These three concepts working in harmony allows for a process to generate impact-driven science communication. We can actually create compelling stories, compelling media products, which again is a little bit of a buzzwordy term, but we'll get into what that actually means by using these three different approaches, by combining them. So what do these actually mean in plain English? Well, the first, collaborative ideation. The idea here is that even the research community understands broader impacts, and certainly the media world understands the kind of the broader impact of the reporting that they're doing, of the storytelling that they're doing, whether it's journalism, nonfiction, what have you. Broader impacts and engaging audiences broadly is a very important part of the work moving forward. So this collaborative ideation is a way to strengthen broader impacts from the get-go. We're going to touch on this in a bit here, but the additional opportunity here is to increase awareness as well as capacity for effective science communication. Again, that's about balancing what PIs and what researchers and what students are actually producing themselves, and where collaborations can basically happen and work together so that the content that's being created, the stories that are being told, are that much more compelling, that much more powerful. And the critical step in this that we'll build on momentarily is this idea of determining the audience and doing that early. So we'll come back to this idea of audience, but I wanted to drop this seed in right at the beginning because the notion of audience is critical because of this MC Escher-like world that we live in now. And then finally, this process of collaborative ideation being built into the workflow, meaning it happens early in the process. After the initial hypothesis comes up with, then we bring a team together collaboratively to figure out what the stories are, how best to tell them. So that's the notion. Those are the kind of the ideas, the principles behind collaborative ideation, working together to come up with a plan, collaboratively working together so that not only does the research happen, but there's an effective science communication plan built around that research as well. Which leads us then to creative project design. And this is the fun part, at least from my perspective, being a multimedia journalist, is thinking through all of the different tools and all of the different platforms that we have at our fingertips now, that we have at our disposal, and thinking about interesting ways of building experiences, films, photo exhibits, all kinds of different types of media to engage audiences. And that process really, that designing for impact process really takes all of those tools and figures out how to play with them. And then part of that as well is balancing, information as well as emotion. Obviously, the research is information driven, but the fact that storytelling at its core is an emotional process, and it's one that we engage with, that we as humans engage with on a daily basis, that emotional process, we have to figure out how to kind of engage that and balance that in a way. And again, that's where collaborative ideation can kind of allow for those conversations to happen. And additionally, the creative project design allows you to shape the narrative, not only about the research itself, but again, this will come back to what AAAS has kind of realized as far as science communication and the power of it. We can actually tell the story, not just of what the research is trying to accomplish or what question is trying to be answered, but also figuring out how to talk about the process, how to talk about how this actually works. So, and then finally, engagement strategies is, again, really finding, once you understand those audiences, really engaging with them at the destinations that they're at, which allows you to kind of conceive of the deliverables. So now I've mentioned audience about 15 times here, and it's worth for a moment stepping back and thinking through what that actually means. Because my sense, my limited sense from the research community and my extended sense from a filmmaking background is that filmmakers and researchers, sometimes, certainly filmmakers, don't really think about the audience. They say, okay, I have this film, I want to make it, it'll show somewhere, bada bing, bada boom. Well, what we know now, because of the way that the media landscape is fractured, it means that we have to really consider those audiences specifically. I did want to just give an overview of what that actually means, of how to think about audiences and the process that I go through as a creative, as a visual storyteller, thinking through how to go out and think about audience. And it kind of runs in this, sweet flowchart here. Basically, I think, in terms of what specific audiences I'm speaking to, what specific messages I'm trying to impart, and the reason why I'm trying to impart those specific messages. Is it action? Is it behavior change? Is it inspiring the next generation? The more specifically you can answer these questions, the better prepared you are to actually create effective, that being the operative word here, effective science communication. And, communication broadly, but specifically for our purposes, we want to figure out how to create stories about the research, about the process, about the state and the wonder of the world around us with a goal in mind. So then finally, moving from that why, we go to how, and thinking, of the multimedia tools, the best approaches that are going to allow you to solve those kind of three questions up above. And then finally, the where. And this is, I think, a really interesting part of the world we live in today. So this defining of the audience here really comes with this in mind, right? How do you use all these different, I use the word products. My journalist, colleagues would not appreciate me using that word, but let's call them what in some cases they are. These different deliverables, these different products that can engage audiences in different places in different ways. And this can be video series, documentary films, products like podcasts, photography, interactives, as in interactive immersive website experiences, or actual experiences either in person or, especially post-COVID, virtually, that are going to allow an audience to engage with the story of ... And then finally, there's all these new platforms to be able to play with. So pulling from these different pools here to figure out, once we understand who the audience is, what the story is, then we can start to talk about, okay, well, what should this story actually take? Which form should it take? And if it's a podcast, then there's a website that it lives on, but then could there also be something like the Moth Radio Hour, where there's a live storytelling, some kind of component brought in around this? And this is the fun part, I think, of taking communication around research to the next level, is understanding the breadth of the tools that are available to us and the breadth of platforms to figure out how we can move the needle with audiences. And this all just might sound like a bunch of craziness from a person who obviously is not trained as a scientist and is kind of coming into this a little bit sideways. But this is something that is taking shape in other places as well. This, the Public Face of Science in America report from the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, this just came out in August, and they identified three priorities, as well as some goals and actions for shaping the public face of science. And this is kind of where the rubber meets the road, in my mind, is the combination of the kind of what is already existing in the media world and the approaches and the multimedia tools that are there for storytellers to engage with, and the priorities realized by the science and research community to basically move the public face of science, forward to kind of have to evolve this, what the public face of science in America is. So these three priorities: building capacity, shaping the narrative, and then developing systemic supports. This is a fascinating report. If you haven't read this, this is very much worth taking a look at. But this, I brought this in just to say that it's, it's not just me thinking about these ideas in a basement somewhere. So right now I want to spend a couple of minutes going through a couple of different case studies that address a different question, have a different media solution, and engage with different audiences. And so we can see kind of the breadth of the different types of tools that are available to us and the strength of those particular tools. So the first one I want to talk about is a film kind of a film project that evolved into a television project for National Geographic that I did about giant carnivorous bats. And how this project started was with a very kind of simple question: how to show a real-world collaboration between a photographer and an ecologist as they sought to discover new behaviors in two species of carnivorous bats. So this was a National Geographic grant-funded project to go out and create media about this collaboration. And what that began with was a short documentary film, primarily aimed at students and at film festivals. And that's this top image here, In Search of Jaacks. And this short film, 10 minutes long, kind of ran through the film festival circuit and then showed in schools in a number of different places. It actually was run by The Atlantic, and it was run by National Geographic Short Film Showcase, and was used in classrooms, not in a way that we'll talk about that was tied to a particular curriculum, but that was shown around. And then that project actually evolved into a much larger project, a much larger media project, which was a television broadcast special that aired on National Geographic Wild to a massive international audience. It actually aired on 6 different continents. And so when we're talking about audience, the kind of the term that you always want to avoid is the general public. And this is where I caveat that idea by saying that, when you have the distribution power of an organization like National Geographic or Nat Geo Wild behind you, then you really can engage the general public, quote unquote, at scale. And so we were able to do that with that project. And we'll tell you what, I want to skip past this. I have the trailer here, but we'll skip past that because I want to make sure that we have time to jump into a couple of the other case studies. So we'll save that one for another time. So another one of the case studies, when it comes to thinking through audience and impact, the different types of media that will get you there, I wanted to talk about another long-term project that I've been working on for almost 10 years now about removing dams and restoring fish passage. And this, again, isn't for a single entity, but has evolved over a long period of time. And the question here is how to build public, private, and political support for removing outdated and defunct dams that block fish passage. And there are pardon the explosion there. There are a broad number of audiences. There's a wide number of audiences that we're trying to engage with this work. So this goes everywhere from local communities and local water rights holders up to policymakers, up to other conservation nonprofits, trying to figure out how we can move some of these projects forward so that support for dam removal can actually grow. And this is a trend that we've seen certainly, really over the last 10 years that has been growing. But how do we keep that momentum up, knowing that there are something like 75,000 dams that dot the American landscape, and many of them are coming to the end of their useful life? So how do we reconsider how we manipulate the landscape with dams? And this is kind of an old project for me. I actually started in this in this subfield, if you will, about 10 years ago with the removal of 2 dams on the Elwha River in Washington State. So this is Glines Canyon Dam coming down over the course of a couple of years, really. And to this date, these 2 dams that came out on the Elwha are the largest to have ever been removed. So I was used to kind of I documented that process for a number of years, and was able to kind of watch as ecosystem restoration was moving forward, which ended up taking me towards into watersheds all over the West. And one of the key questions I was trying to figure out with this was, how do you really kind of change the story, or how do you change the nuance of the story that people have around salmon? And again, this isn't a specific research question. I'm not documenting specific research with this, but there's a particular question I have about how do you kind of interface what people think they know about salmon and about salmon science and restoration, and how do you kind of change the conversation to include a little bit more nuance? Because when you get down to it, what most people think of when they think of salmon is this picture. They think of big adult fish pushing back up a river in a place like Alaska, or jumping over the falls in a place like Washington State or in the Columbia River Basin. And what I was really interested with this dam removal project, knowing that many of those 75,000 dams that are in the U.S. are not all Hoover Dam, the question was how do you change people's concepts of salmon and their life history and how that works? So what that has meant from a visual standpoint, and again, thinking through how to, work backwards from a goal and an audience to the actual media itself, what that means is spending a lot of time with little fish to show this idea that for a fish of that size, a couple of inches long, a juvenile fish, a 6 foot or a 6-inch barrier may as well be Hoover Dam. So images like this can help to start change in a very succinct way, start to change some of the perception that we have about salmon. But that goes, again, to a specific audience. That goes to people who are already thinking about fish in a way where they might be able to change their thinking about conservation or about infrastructure in a river because they're already thinking about fish. A lot of this work happens with water rights holders, irrigators, ranchers who could care less about fish. So what do you show those people? And how do you think about that audience specifically so that they're engaged in what ultimately is a fish passage project, but how do you frame it for them? And not to get away from the surprise here, but the way to do that is by showing infrastructure. Without diving too deep into that, the idea here is that you show actually how improved infrastructure solves what ultimately is a problem for irrigators, right? Having to actually maintain these irrigation systems, particularly using small dams, especially throughout the West, although we have plenty of mill dams in the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic that functionally cause the same issue and are equally outdated. So for those people, for that specific audience, again, you have to think about another type of tool and another type of deliverable. So the idea here is to shoot photographs of the process. You'll see in the top left, the dam, what it was like in place. You'll see on the bottom right, an engineered structure that accomplishes the same goal for the irrigator, which is to put water into this headgate so that they can continue to irrigate. But it shows it from a perspective where there is not a fish in sight. And the reason I'm bringing this up again is to give you an example of what it means to think about how audience determines the approach of the story, the tool that you use, what storytelling tool you use, and what deliverable you come up with. And just to build on that for a second, it wouldn't be appropriate necessarily, it wouldn't work to walk into a water user's house and into their kitchen table and to show them a video, to plop a laptop down. That's just not an effective communication tool for that audience. Whereas a bunch of photographs printed out from Costco and you can kind of lay them out on a table, that actually turns out as a pretty effective conversation starter for helping irrigators understand how this could benefit them. So again, the reason to show this work is to talk through the process of what it means to think about audience and the approach and the tool. And then finally, I think that allows you to kind of step back and think, okay, from a research perspective, this is a slightly tangential piece to the actual dam removal. These are bull trout spawning in the North Fork of the Blackfoot River in Montana, working with a couple of biologists up there, as I have been for the last couple of years. So when it comes to actually showing the natural history of a piece that is, again, tied into that dam removal, but is a little bit separate, knowing that the idea is to create empathy with an audience and to create awe. Part of what motivates me as a photographer is having people look at an image or watch a film and stop in their tracks and think about the subject and the content of either those images or that film. And so in that capacity, you can switch gears depending on your audience and change the approach and the tool to accomplish different goals. And I figured because this was bio at noon, I did want to sneak a couple of bull trout pictures in there. So there's that. So the last case study that I want to talk about is a new one that's kind of starting to take shape, that has certainly been impacted by the global pandemic that we're in, but that I think shows a lot of promise, and that is plastic pollution. And I just want to caveat what I say at the beginning by with two caveats here. One is that this is ongoing and in development, so there's a lot of interest in the process. We're in the process now on a number of these projects. And then second, from an image making standpoint, before I get in too much trouble calling this microplastics, because this is fishing line and thread. It's clearly not microplastics. I know there's a distinction, so I just wanted to make sure these are some of the challenges from a storytelling perspective that we are going to encounter with this case study, with this suite of projects. But so going back to the kind of the same format here, what's the question? Who are the audience? Who are the different audiences that we're looking to engage with, and what is the media that is going to be the best tool to engage those different audiences? And again, this is an interpretation from my perspective at the Harrington School, but the idea here, the basic question, or what's about to come down around the corner, if you will, is that there's this interdisciplinary group of researchers at URI who are trying to understand the distribution, concentration, and effects of microplastic pollution. There's a broad number of audiences. This is still very much in development, but some initial audiences, at least, that we've talked about have been in these early collaborative discussions have been students, policymakers, local communities, industry, which has started to get us thinking about media, the actual media solution for this kind of communication. And there's couple different approaches that we're taking right now. Student-produced media as a way to engage undergraduate students and kind of broaden the tent, if you will, of the creation of science communication materials. There's a short video series, and then there's an opportunity, I think, here for innovative approaches and experiences and that kind of creative project design that I mentioned up at the front that there shows real potential. So there's two of these projects that are underway that I think are going to be, a little bit of a case study for us now, but they are in their infancy and they obviously have been impacted by COVID. So first is with Professor Andy Davies et al., who are working on a project, Are Microplastics a Vector for Organic Pollutants and Disease in Marine Food Webs? This is funded by Sea Grant and is working in collaboration with Rhode Island PBS. And so what's a really interesting opportunity with this project is we actually have the ability to create a short video series that will be designed in collaboration with local K-12 teachers who are going to help us design and think about content, video series, photographs, all of the deliverables that I mentioned, that will actually allow for that content to be used in K-12 classrooms with NEA, actual standards, being able to use the media to teach to specific standards, which is going to be really exciting. We're just beginning the process of that. But again, we're figuring out the methodologies, the tools, the different types of mediums that we could use and how those will work together. And pardon my freezing video there. So the other potential, the other project that is a case study that is about just starting to get underway after some delays because of COVID is with Dr. J.P. Walsh at the CRC. And we're actually using some funding from the Pan-Hellenic Society to create and engage undergraduate students in, not only in research. Dr. Walsh is leading a research program gathering, mapping mapping microplastics from shore to seafloor within Narragansett Bay. So actually looking at the distribution and concentration of microplastics around the bay, but we're figuring out ways of building experiential students' experiences into that research process. So the idea is we're actually going to get URI journalism undergrads out both to cover what the research is happening in the field, but then also to think about how you take that kind of research and the process. The results are going to be preliminary, so a lot of it is going to be processed to engage the public around this issue in our own backyard. So this project is going to lead us towards, on the left hand there, you'll see we are actually currently developing in a capstone course that I'm teaching both this semester and next semester, we are going to be working on building a story map using ArcGIS, which is an amazing tool and platform for sharing multimedia stories in a very centralized, very easily designed and easy to use platform and interface there. And this also gives us an opportunity to think about how we actually innovate with our multimedia tools. This is something that I'm really excited about, is thinking about, okay, how do we actually move into and conceive of filmmaking practices, of multimedia tools, of storytelling techniques that are going to kind of push the needle a little bit. And what we're doing with that is actually using 360 video as a way of documenting both the research itself and ideally these different locations where we will be around the bay. And the idea, this again is, it's a 360 video here. It's been kind of animated, so it gives you a sense of what that will be like. But using the 360 functionality of YouTube, we are actually able to embed those videos into a story map that would allow somebody experiencing this story map on a desktop computer to actually point and click with the mouse and navigate around to be able to see and experience these images in 360 degrees, which may seem like all whiz-bang kind of interesting tricks, but I think it does present us with an interesting opportunity about how we think about how to use different types of media, what different types of media are appropriate for what types of stories, what types of research, etc. So as those two case studies continue to develop, at least from my perspective, as a science communicator, what I'm thinking about using the kind of the outline that I talked about up above, this idea of collaborative ideation, creative project design, and engagement strategies leading to effective engagement strategies, there's kind of three primary outcomes that I'm hoping these case studies will allow us to really kind of experiment with and play with and develop a system for. The first is to produce compelling media that's designed to inform and inspire behavioral and policy change. And I understand that that kind of outcome is not necessarily the case for every single project. Not every single project is going to have an inspirational or behavioral or policy change kind of connected to the research. I don't think that that is necessarily it's not necessarily a requirement for these, but certainly in these two projects, I think there are ample opportunities to at least have those discussions and consider how we can engage and document and think about the story of the research with those ideas in mind. The second is to engage undergraduate students in experiential education opportunities, again, as I mentioned. And the reason behind that really, again, is to broaden this tent of what it means to be working in science communication, but really what it means to be telling compelling stories in whatever medium about science. This clearly is something that as a nation, as this kind of grew as an economy, this is such an important mission for us to kind of consider at this moment in time, and engaging undergraduate students in really kind of interesting and compelling ways of getting out in the field and interactive ways of actually doing this work, not just learning about it passively in the classroom, but actually getting out and doing it, certainly is my goal over in the Harrington School. And then finally, that third desired outcome is leveraging partnerships to engage multiple audiences. And for example, this is where Rhode Island PBS and PBS Learning Media will hopefully, and I really believe will be incredible partners in helping us get the word out and finding effective ways of getting the word out to a large set of different audiences. Again, thinking through what those specific audiences are, that's part of the work of the process of actually going through the creation of this kind of storytelling, science media storytelling here. But that's ultimately the goal, is to figure out how do we get these stories out to generate the most impact, as much impact as we can, rather. So with that, that's really the kind of, that's what I got for you. That is the idea with the case study for microplastics at URI. Hopefully this gives you a sense of, my background in that, what I've been able to bring to the table, the kind of stories that I've been interested in and going out and doing, and what I see really as the future for impact science communication at the University of Rhode Island, because I think that there are there's some incredible opportunities coming up, and it seems like our university, this collection of folks, are positioned just so well to really kind of take the conversations that are happening about science, about research, about all of the incredible work that you guys are doing, and spreading it kind of far and wide. So with that, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. And, you know, feel free to be in touch with any questions. I did just want to put in one plug. If you're interested at all in science media and science communication and what's happening, I did just want to say that we're having Ed Yong give a talk about what it's been like to actually report on COVID-19. Ed Yong is a journalist. He wrote I Contain Multitudes. He works for The Atlantic and is an incredible journalist. He's giving a talk next week, Thursday, October 29 at 5 p.m. So I did want to give a little plug, because I think this is going to be a really powerful, hearing about some really powerful reporting from somebody who has been living it as much as anybody else has over the last 7 or 8 months. So with that, thank you very much. I really appreciate you guys taking the time, and would love to stick around and answer any questions that you may have.
Great. Thank you very much, Jason. Sorry, Victoria, go ahead.
Thank you so much. That was an amazing talk. Are you able to see the chat? We have a couple questions that came in during your talk.
Oh, yes. Let me hit the chat real quick. Yeah, I can stop at the... Yes. Yeah, user-centric is fine with the excerpt. So let's start with that. Oh, no, this was perhaps privately. So maybe we will not read the private one, because that doesn't make any sense. All right, so from Suzanne Mendendur, just like the media landscape has changed with outlets not staying in their lane, there is no longer a general public in science communication. We can't draw on our audience having a single shared experience. For example, not everyone has seen a popular film or knows the same fairy tale. How do you deal with that? That's a great question. I think this is why these conversations need to happen early in the process. It's much easier to have conversations about where are the specific audiences that you want to engage early in, and I mean that in the research process, early in that kind of hypothesis design, much earlier in the process than we've done this research. Now, who do we talk to about it? Who do we share it with? So this is kind of the plug, if you will. I answer that question by saying, having these questions earlier on allows you to think through where those audiences are. And, this is, for example, with the Sea Grant project, Rhode Island PBS and PBS Learning Media are really important partners for that. And so we can think through those specific deliverables for, K through 12 education. Now, I'm not saying it's not going to be possible given the budgets, given people's time. We can't, not every piece is going to, not every research project, not every one of these collaborations can lead to, an Academy Award winning documentary film, for example. So the question is figuring out what is the right tool to engage the audiences that we collectively feel are the most important for this research. Does that make sense? Perhaps? Let's see. So follow up? Yeah, so I'll ask a couple others here from the chat. Let's see here. What made me decide to move from the private sector into academia, and what do you think the role of scientists is in SciComm? Should we be collaborators, collaborating with filmmakers, artists, etc., to tell the story of our research, or working to create our own SciComm projects? Okay, so to the first one, the opportunity to kind of come into academia was a little bit, it's kind of a longer story perhaps, but I think what's been really exciting for me in this process is for my professional experience before joining URI was a lot of the knocking on the door, the kind of coverage, not collaboration. Part of that was the process, was knocking on the door saying, hey, this seems like an interesting bit of research. Can I talk to you about it? which is useful. What's really, what is really interesting and heartening for me now is to start that again very early in the process and say, well, how can we think through what the science communication could be, not just we should cover this for any given outlet. So that was one of the big motivating factors to come into the academy, was to come into the inside and be able to think about these kinds of tools in a way where we could rise off ships much earlier in the process. And I think that there's a balance. I think what certainly scientists and the research community should absolutely, per what AAAS has talked about and the public face of science communication for scientists is absolutely important. Understanding how this tool is both the media creation tool as well as the media consumption tool is important. I think there's a limit to that, though, and this is where collaboration comes in, because I don't know that it's really useful to expect that every PI, amongst all the other things that they do, are now suddenly photographers and filmmakers and podcasters. That's an unreasonable ask. So being conversant in the technology and the platforms, very useful, very important. Being fluent, I think that's the opportunity where collaboration can come in and help move these projects forward. Do we want to do a live one, or I've got a handful more for sure in the chat.
I think keeping going with the chat will be great.
Will be good. Okay, great. Okay, so let's see. How do you balance the demand or requirement by a client such as TV networks or media outlets to add drama to the story through controversy or problems, with staying true to the science and presenting potentially more boring content? Yeah, okay, so this is really, this is a challenge. And I think this is why these conversations, these collaborative conversations happening early is a much more authentic practice of it than trying to come in, cover science that's already been done and saying, well, God, what is the drama in this? Because let's be real, when we understand what storytelling is at its core, storytelling is conflict. That can be uppercase C conflict, that can be lowercase c conflict, but conflict is what drives story. So simple explanatory reporting, there is a place for that, but it's challenging to do that all of the time. So I think having an understanding of what that conflict is, and that doesn't necessarily, you don't have to inject drama. This isn't something, trust me, I'm a television producer. I've worked with plenty of television producers who say, pump up the volume. That was actually part of the reason why I wanted to show the Bats trailer, because you can see the drama in how television specifically deals with the scientific process. But at its core, what that television show was actually about was these two people, these two different professionals coming together from very different fields, working to actually discover some of these new behaviors in those giant carnivorous bats. So I think ultimately, to answer that question, it's a conversation, it's a dialogue that needs to happen. I don't think it doesn't serve anyone to kind of arbitrarily or falsely inject drama into any kind of science communication. But we have to understand, this is where involving an interdisciplinary group can help, because the storytellers on that side of the spectrum understand what, that conflict is what drives story. And so it's really a framing question, not could you break a couple of beakers on camera kind of thing, So let's see, moving down, what advice do I have for graduate students who want to improve their sci-comics skills and explore new forms of media? That's a great question. I feel like that is one that's evolving, especially at URI. Certainly there's something like the SciWrite program. I think there are opportunities out there. And this goes to this larger point that right now, these two fields are remarkably separate. You have kind of the research community, the science community. You have the media and the storytelling community, let's call them. And there's just very few places. That middle ground there is very It's a very kind of large, expansive gray area. It's a little bit of the Wild West. And what I interpret that as is not as a burden for us, but as an opportunity, because that means that we get to help define it. And there certainly are traditional media outlets that have done this well for a very long time. Look at a show like Radiolab, right? Does this incredibly well, right? You know, and you're seeing this push in very, you know, established places like Netflix, pushing into this kind of science content. So you've got the worlds that are kind of inching closer together. But what advice I have is that, you know, the opportunities are kind of few and far between. This isn't like an accounting degree where you figure out how to do accounting and then you become an accountant. It is a winding, you know, kind of a crazy winding path. So reaching out to science communicators that you admire would be the first place to start, would be my first kind of piece of concrete advice. If you really like Radiolab, then you should try and get in touch with Jad Abumrad, that kind of thing. It's worth a shot. All he's going to do is say no, you know, if like that's the worst that can happen. So, but actually going out to see people who are modeling the type of science communication that you're interested in and engaging with them to see how they got there. Because again, nobody's getting there on any kind of direct path. You mentioned starting early collaborations with scientists a few times now. How do you think this process also changes the science questions that get asked and the resulting impact of the research? Well, the resulting impact of the research, I feel, can be, all ships can rise when you think about, again, how do you take that broader impact statement and actually have it live up to be what it's supposed to do? How do you think about this in a new and engaging way? And not to say, that's not to be, you know, condescending or punitive at all. I just think that this is an incredible opportunity to think about this more creatively without suddenly shoving the burden. The way I feel like certainly federal funding is set up right now is it kind of shoves the burden of broader impacts onto PIs who have no training in this kind of field. So that's not a problem that I'm expecting PIs to solve. I'm expecting, you know, I'm thinking that there are opportunities to think about that in a collective way that would further the impact. In terms of how the process changes the scientific questions, that's a great question. How involving, you know, communications collaborators from the beginning might change the hypotheses. That's a great question. I think this is a very project by project. I think there are very few formulaic ways to go about this. And at least from my perspective and experience in the field, what I enjoy about the process is kind of starting the process over and seeing which direction it goes. So if it does change it, I think that that could be a whole new field, you know, that could be engaging in a field that there's not a lot of work being done in now. So I think it's an interesting question. I don't have an answer for it, but I would love to have a, you know, dialogue about that. From Danielle Moore here. Let's see, what tools and training do you recommend, that a graduate student learn? Let's see, I feel like I answered that a little bit, but I think the big thing here is to find the places that are doing this well and to start modeling those. As far as specific hard skills, storytelling skills, you know, how to edit, how to take photographs, it's a little bit tangential I think in the first process. The first kind of place to understand this from is who is doing this well, and how can you think about modeling those individual skills. There are places to go to learn how to do filmmaking boot camps, photography boot camps, but there's nobody who's really doing this well specifically for the science community, which sounds like an opportunity to me, but I'll just leave that there. And then David Smith put in the actual link there, the public face of science in America, which again I think is a really, really useful document. I have an atrociously long, I'll show you real quickly. I have an atrociously long slide that, you know, from a visual design perspective is not that great, but the actual goals within each of those priorities are very much worth diving deeper into. And I think actually build on that collaborative process I was talking about project design, about having these conversations early, and about actually using those conversations to develop engagement strategies. So this is far too much text in a slide, but I will include this slide in the PDF. I'll make the PDF of the talk available, and that slide will be in there, because I think that distillation of what those priorities are and what each of those goals says, I think gives us a starting point. Ultimately, what this comes down to is these two fields are, are kind of far apart in some ways and closer in other ways. And I think the place to begin is to figure out how we start to have these conversations about using the tools, multimedia tools, and then using those tools to engage new audiences in new ways that are compelling and that we can actually, from my perspective at least, drive change. Does that make sense? Maybe. That was a little bit of a ranty, it's Zoom. It's a little bit of a ranty answer.
And the not so much feedback from the other side. There's one more question from Sarah Stevens, and then if we could switch over to the postdoc and grad student meeting, that would be great. It was just above David's link.
Oh, yeah. Okay. From Sarah. Yeah. How do you deal with underserved communities who do not have access to a wide variety of media? The media that you've mentioned and talk often require more high-tech devices beyond a simple cell phone, for example. I'm thinking of global communities where information like this is extremely important to disseminate. That's a great question, and it's a really important question. In my previous life, I've run filmmaking boot camps in South Africa, in township communities there. I've run filmmaking boot camps on Native American reservations in the American Southwest. You're not going to get National Geographic quality, television quality out of user-centric devices and participatory media collaboration, but we have to separate those goals. That's not the same goal. So if you're talking about working with underserved communities, then we need to figure out what technology is accessible, and really, I mean, the penetration of mobile, high-powered mobile devices globally is something worth considering. It has never been a better time to be a media maker, both because of the networked distribution that we have through social media and because of the tool itself. So I think there are absolutely ways of considering how we not deal with, but really how we collaborate with underserved communities to create stories that are impactful in those communities. But again, that's a specific project. We're not going to do that specifically with with plastic mapping in Narragansett Bay. We're not really going to do that, with this Sea Grant project with microplastics in Narragansett Bay. That's a specific project goal. That's a specific audience you want to engage with, which means that conversation should happen early. We should figure out, okay, if that's our particular audience, then we need to figure out how to engage that audience where they are at. It goes a little bit back to what I was saying about showing up to a rancher's house to go sit at their kitchen table to talk about dam removal by pulling out a laptop and saying, "Can I show you a movie? I've never been kicked out of a house faster." So then that means if you're working in communities that are underserved, that are under-resourced, then we need to figure out how to work with those communities to figure out meaningful, maybe this is kids, maybe this is building, a photo exhibit of work that kids are able to do, and you can base it off of pictures that they take on their cell phone, and you can take a $500 printer, in the ship with you, and you make a whole photo exhibit of work that kids do. I think there are ways to have those conversations. I don't see this as being exclusive in the sense that just because I'm using state-of-the-art equipment and using 360 video and 8K cameras doesn't mean that science communication and media doesn't have a more participatory, a more user-focused, and a much more kind of technologically streamlined approach to still creating impactful deliverables. Does that make sense to that question? Okay, great, Sarah. Yeah. That's a great question, and I think that's one that, you know, I think having those conversations again early is the key to figuring out how do we make the, you know, the ostensibly the reason we're there researching is to come back with actionable information. So how do we make that actionable information stick? And media, I think, is a very effective tool to do that, but it has to be appropriate to the audience where they are at.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, if postdocs and grad students would hang out and we can continue the discussion. Thank you everyone else for your interaction and questions and for coming to Bio at Noon.
Thanks, everybody.
Great job. Thanks, Jason.
Thanks, Jason.
Yep.
Thanks, Jason.
Yeah, hey, thank you.
See you later.
Yep.
Hi, thank you. I was one of the people, I'm one of the students from Katrina. I asked the question about like how you think working together might change like the hypotheses and the actual work that ends up getting done.
Great. Yeah, thank you for that question. I think that's an interesting one for sure. Most of the projects that I've been brought in on, the very heavily science communication ones, the ones that are less coveragey, have been, that process has already, you know, I'm trying to kind of claw my way higher into the earlier into the process as far as the research community is concerned. And so up until this point, I haven't been, you know, haven't had the opportunity to have a conversation early enough to say, well, what if we asked this question or studied that piece instead of, you know? So I think it's a great question.
Yeah, no, so recently I got the opportunity to work with like a group of like coral scientists who are all like early career.